I'm a shadow in your subconscious. A blemish on your fragile little psyche. You know me. You just don't know it.
The mad god dangled the nightingale over the gaping void. This thief had revelled in the shadows. This thief had exploited the fundamental fear of finite beings to purloin their possessions, cloaking himself in the darkness of unlit corners, leaving honest souls destitute. He felt security in the shadowy recesses where he could not be perceived. But his comfort had turned to cold sweat and kicking feet in the face of the great darkness. Sheogorath held him there by the scruff, reaching through a rent in Oblivion to let the thief peer at Padamai. And only when the nightingale's feathers were ruffled and his chirps turned to screams, only when his splendid black armour was soiled and stinking, only when he was truly, wholly afraid of the dark, did the mad god relent. Sheogorath heaved him back through the rift, back into Dementia, the only place that would accept him after this utter degradation, and like a stained old rag, tossed him into the effluvium flowing along the fringes of Crucible. Thus did Sheogorath teach Nocturnal the crucial difference between shadow and darkness. And so concludes the 16th Accord of Madness, one for every hole in the rickety old Orbic wheel. Sheogorath shook his aching hands savagely, as if a venomous spider were crawling across it. Documenting his 16 stunts had been almost as entertaining as actually carrying them out. He was delighted with the way he had dramatised them in prose. And yet, after the quill had jettisoned from his hand, spraying ink across the floor like a startled squid, he found himself dissatisfied. Creativity gave existence colour, a means of grazing his fingertips along the underside of fulfillment, tantalisingly out of reach. Alas, as always, he would emerge from his studio feeling empty. He sprawled out on the floor, and reality seeped back in. He could reshape the aisles again, make a more pleasant reality to be trapped in, but it seemed like only yesterday that Jiggalag had done just that. So, he did what he always did. He plotted his next trick, his next accord of madness. Perhaps the Outlander wandering his realm would be a suitable candidate. Sheogorath, the mad god, the comforter of men, lord of the never there. His sphere is madness and creativity, which are one and the same, yet amorphous, more of a gas giant than a planet, if that gas were nitrous oxide. So nebulous is his sphere that the Padamaic mortal races cannot even decide whether he should be condemned or consorted with. According to the Dunmer, in the text titled The House of Troubles, Sheogorath is the king of madness. He always tests the Dunmer for mental weakness. In many legends, he is called upon by one Dunmer faction against another. In half of these stories, he does not betray those who called him, further confusing the issue of his place in the scheme of things. Can he help us? Is he not an obstacle? Unlike Aedra-fearing Anuic cultures, Padamaic cultures like the Dunmer do not denounce the Daedra simply for not being mortal ancestors. There is value to be extracted even from the more malevolent spirits. The four corners of the House of Troubles, Malacath, Mehrunes Dagon, Molag Bal, and Sheogorath, are often referred to as the testing gods. That's because they test the Dark Elves in their pursuit of enlightenment, through the Sigic endeavour. Malacath was once Trinomac, and therefore he is the historic adversary of Lorkhan and Boethia. He would aid the blasphemers of the deep, if it means spiting the Prince of Plots. Mehrunes Dagon is the destroyer, and would raze Lorkhan's wondrous creation to the ground if given the chance. Molag Bal is greedy, and would waste the potential of mortals by taking them as slaves. To him, all mortal blood is there to be tainted, and would deprive the changed ones of their unique heritage. And Sheogorath is a wild card. His motives are unpredictable, and he would be a danger to the society crafted by the good Daedra. As each corner threatens high-velocity culture, so too do they offer valuable lessons to all Chimer who would seek the secret syllable. They test for physical weakness, for survival skills, for pure bloodlines, and in the case of Sheogorath, for mental frailty. Is a force that strengthens your will truly a foe? The Khajiit perceive the mad god in a similar light, for like the Dunmer with their Psijic endeavour, the beast folk of elsewhere believe in the path that all cats must walk, or more appropriately, the lattice that they must climb to Lessware, the sands behind the stars. Sheogorath is considered an adversarial spirit, and the silent priest Amandro writes, Sheogorath, the mind god, his sphere is the mortal mind and its stability. He tests Khajiit on the path by making them doubt the truth of their own thoughts, beliefs, and actions. Sheogorath has his own motives. He is a friend to those most susceptible to straying from the path, and as a result, he is also their enemy. But it's not easy to identify an enemy behind a comforting face, when he makes you laugh and takes you higher. That is the conundrum of this video. Sheogorath is difficult to define, his arts are subjective, and madness lies within subjectivity, within the dazzling valiance of variance.
The Daedrologist wanders my realm like a tourist. His mortal arrogance is a form of madness, I suppose. He can roam a little longer, until he begins to feel right at home. Then, perhaps, I'll honour him with an invite to my palace.
The veined blue sky above the Hill of Suicides began to turn violet. The gnarled limbs of the surrounding trees became malevolent silhouettes in the fading light. Haskill assured us that this realm was not subject to the upending of the Dragonbone hourglass, and that only Sheogorath himself determined the flow of time, or the lack thereof. Yet the days rolled into night just as they did back on Nirn, and while Daedrologists still can't come to a consensus on whether the Magnus Rift can be seen in the Oblivion realms, the chill of night still seeped into my bones. So I hopped from my perch, casting a levitation spell to slow my descent, and I followed the dimly lit path in search of a place to rest. I pitied the tortured souls upon the hill too much to taunt them with my ability to sleep. The only camp I found was flooded, so I settled for a crook beneath a great arcing root that looked more like one of old Mora's tentacles than anything arboreal. On the morrow I would come upon New Sheoth in all its paradoxical glory. Through the indigo haze I could make out the turrets of Sheogorath's palace. The symmetrical structure loomed over the capital. I imagined Uncle Sheo atop this perch, surveying his domain, an antic spirit hunched and lolling, eyes rolling over rooftops and along border walls, scraggly arms encompassing Bliss and Crucible, infusing the atmosphere of each district with its own crackpot vapours that sent people plumbing deeper into madness. With every breath and heartbeat, the residents felt more secure in this bedlam. Or perhaps the prince was preoccupied with governing his own mind, the immaterial part of it anyway, to be intoxicating his tenants. Maybe the mere act of living a mortal life was sufficient to explain them going silly. Admittedly, it was hard to think clearly with the cold crawling under my clothes and into my ears, but the Shivering Isles are so unlike the other planes of Oblivion. Sheogorath is so unlike his peers after all. While most mortal inhabitants of other realms are there by force or worship, or a confused combination of the two, those who dwell in the asylum come by choice, or by invitation. They're enticed by the prospect of a realm more befitting their divergent minds. Uncle Sheo welcomes all kinds. We can reasonably assume that any individuals who come to the Isles by choice have less conventional personalities, and Sheogorath feeds off of the energy of the insane and the imaginative. In my last journal entry from the madhouse, I spoke about the various groups of dissidents dwelling in Sheogorath's realm, from the followers of Gyub to the heretics and zealots, who worship Arden Sol as the true prince of the Shivering Isles, decrying Sheogorath as a fraud. Not everyone in the realm is trying to dethrone him though. Most of the inhabitants are leading their own lives. Some spend their time writing poems or painting landscapes of the Isles. These creatives take inspiration from the fey, otherworldly nature of Sheogorath's plane. There are introverts and insomniacs, paranoids and pain lovers, addicts and arsonists. Each and every one of them adds to the gestural abstraction that is the asylum. And that's why his sphere encompasses both madness and creativity, for they are one and the same. The blessings of Sheogorath, incanted by his devotees, goes as follows. For our Lord Sheogorath, without whom all thought would be linear and all feeling would be fleeting. Blessed are the madmen, for they hold the keys to secret knowledge. Blessed are the phobic, always wary of that which would do them harm. Blessed are the obsessed, for their courses are clear. Blessed are the addicts, may they quench the thirst that never ebbs. Blessed are the murderers, for they have found beauty in the grotesque. Blessed are the fire lovers, for their hearts are always warm. Blessed are the artists, for in their hands the impossible is made real. Blessed are the musicians, for in their ears they hear the music of the soul. Blessed are the sleepless, as they bask in wakeful dreaming. Blessed are the paranoid, ever watchful for our enemies. Blessed are the visionaries, for their eyes see what might be. Blessed are the pain lovers, for in their suffering we grow stronger. Blessed is the mad god, who tricks us when we are foolish, punishes us when we are wrong, tortures us when we are unmindful, and loves us in our imperfection. The madhouse is an intricate tapestry, and while the inhabitants may be categorized by their various psychoses, they are led to believe by Sheogorath that their minds are less constricted in his realm of chaos, as opposed to the Mundus, which is a realm of restriction. And to an extent, he is telling them the truth. The monomyth states as much in the Old Meri creation story. Anu encompassed and encompasses all things. So that he might know himself, he created Anwiel, his soul and the soul of all things. Anwiel, as all souls, was given to self-reflection, and for this he needed to differentiate between his forms, attributes, and intellects. Thus was born Sithis, who was the sum of all the limitations Anwiel would utilize to ponder himself. Anwiel, who was the soul of all things, therefore became many things, and this interplay was and is the Aurbis. The interplay of Anu and Padamai is essential for allowing all concepts to exist. Without limitation, Anu could not be comprehended, a light so bright that it does not permit sight. Anwiel's ruminations eventually took forms, such as Auriel, who is time, and Magnus, who is magic. One of these, Lorkhan, was more of a limit than a nature, so he could never last long anywhere. As he entered every aspect of Anwiel, Lorkhan would plant an idea that was almost wholly based on limitation. He outlined a plan to create a soul for the Aurbis, a place where the aspects of aspects might even be allowed to self-reflect. He gained many followers, even Auriel, when told he would become the king of the new world, agreed to help Lorkhan. So they created the Mundus, where their own aspects might live, and became the Atada. But this was a trick. As Lorkhan knew, this world contained more limitations than not, and was therefore hardly a thing of Anu at all. Mundus was the house of Sithis. Sheogorath comes to the mad and the inspired with an alluring offer. In his domain, the limits of Lorkhan, of Auriel, and of the Earthbones do not hold jurisdiction. Sheogorath is a Daedra. He can be whatever he pleases, as can his realm. Sheogorath says as much in his first interaction with the champion of Cyrodiil.
Daedra are the embodiment of change and permanency. I'm no different, except in the ways that I am.
Change is all well and good, but order is also important when structuring a plane of existence. Sheogorath knows that all too well, but I won't utter the jig word in such close proximity to the Mad God's throne. An argument could be made that a realm ruled by one immortal spirit is far more oppressive than one governed by many immortal spirits, most of whom are considered dead or at least distant. Just take Haskell's words on the nature of time in the Shivering Isles. Inhabitants of the Shivering Isles are affected by time, but we are not subject to it. We are subjects of Lord Sheogorath, who subjects us to whatever subjects he is in the mood to subjudicate, because time is subjective. As we established earlier, madness lies within subjectivity, but when you're at the mercy of one being's subjectivity, from your perspective, it might as well be considered objective. Ironically, this particular point is subjective and speculative. I'm sure many inhabitants of the Isles would claim that they are more free in Sheogorath's realm, while many others view it as more of a trap than Lorkhan's creation. Both Sheogorath and Lorkhan are commonly referred to by the title of trickster, mind you. To some, the name Asylum would be appropriate, as they sought refuge in Uncle Sheo's embrace, while to others, the name Asylum would be appropriate because it is a borderless institution that segregates them from the realm of the sane. In the end, it matters little to the mad god whether his tenants want to live in his madhouse or not. Giving them the freedom to make that decision would go against the purpose of the madhouse. So, to put it more simply, Sheogorath's innate dichotomy permeates all aspects of him and his realm. It is freeform, yet it is full of figurative padded walls. As I approached New Sheoth, the walls that bore down on me were not padded, but high and made of stone, a cell for the most illustrious inpatients. Around the city's flank the cobbles curled, revealing the palace protruding from its rear, and a waterfall split in two, spilling into the swamps that saturate all of Dementia. The heavy wooden doors leading to Crucible were reinforced with iron, wrought in symmetrical, interlacing patterns, as beautiful as they were emblematic of the tangled streets in the city beyond. A lone seducer stood sentinel beside the doors, camouflaged by her dun-hued skin. A pull of the ring clenched between the teeth of the embossed iron imp, and I was in Crucible. The region of Dementia is dotted with graveyards, and treading carefully is crucial to avoid plunging into ballywog-ridden bogs. You'd think the civilized culmination of Dementia within New Sheoth would offer a respite from the muck and depression, but you'd be wrong. Here the quags are infused with mortal effluent, too viscous to have the decency to flow beyond the city limits. Instead, they undulate, emitting noisome fumes from bubbling pores. Crucible is aptly named because it is a melting pot of all the nastiest, most neurotic humours in the ecosystem of the Isles. Blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile, forming a sickly synthesis in the crucible of the madhouse. Nevertheless, there is a charm to this weeping ulcer of a district. Like the acid reflux after a spicy meal, Crucible is brimming with compelling characters. From the shifty-eyed smith named Cutter, eager to comment on how effective her weapons are for shedding blood, and how reliable her armor pieces are for protecting vital veins and arteries, to the enchantress Ajazda, who is stricken by paranoia at the coming storm. Her fears may not be completely unfounded though, what with the impending Grey March. There's the kleptomaniac Brifhauer, seeking 5 flawless pearls which will surely placate his propensity for pilfering, and the suicidal Hircine Clytumnus, who desperately wishes to die, but fears inciting the mad god's ire, and ending up on the Hill of Suicides for all eternity. Say what you will about Crucible, the stench and the sorrow, but there is no shortage of eccentric personalities. And on the bright side, figuratively speaking, the gloomy overcast skies make the streets and buildings seem quaint and rustic, rather than dirty and dilapidated, and the persistent drizzle serves as a decent deodorant. Alas, after a bit too much time in Crucible, I found I had developed a case of the collywobbles, and my eyes yearned for a bit of vibrancy. So I sought out the misaligned maw of the hideous stone hunger that served as the gateway between dementia and mania. And as the doors swung open, the smell of mildew and sewage was vanquished by citrus and spice, a perfume so strong it seared my sinuses and brought me to tears. It was as if every fruit and flower from Ifri's green songs had been distilled into an all-inclusive, flagrant fragrance. Whatever scents I'd left behind in Crucible were scorched from my memory, replaced by colours saturated beyond my ability to appreciate them. Bliss was unapologetic, manic, ostentatious, everything Crucible was not. If this was euphoria, then I was too overstimulated to sense it. Bliss was a migraine made manifest. I've had headaches batter against my temples like they're trying to burst from the pressurized confines of my skull. But this district was like the inverse. The headache was all around me, sensing the calm within my mind and besieging it. And it seemed as though I wasn't the only one feeling that way. Fanrien cowers in the streets, so paralysed by paranoia that he's forgotten how it feels to be rested. And insomnia only exacerbates his symptoms. He can't sleep in his own home, as he fears the walls will close in on him, or the ceiling will collapse and crush him. And it's a phobia I can't even call irrational. I remember, during the Thracian Plague, I spent so long in isolation that I developed a strange kind of dependence on the walls of my small study. I would stand outside my tower at night to take in fresh air, and my cabin fever made the faintly flickering stars overhead seem unreal. Like an umbrous blanket had been thrown over my world to suffocate me, and through the woven perforations light bled in, like signal fires from some realm beyond. If only I could break through the fabric, the claustrophobia would surely evanesce. I would hike by the ocean, and the vastness of the coastal panoramas was so overwhelming to my long-confined mind that I felt waves of vertigo strike me whenever I stood still, as if the endless blue above would engulf me, mocking the laws of gravity. It took many afternoons on the cliffs to overcome that vertigo, to sleep soundly in my small study again. So how could I lurch over Fanrien and pass judgment? Sleep is a luxury afforded to the safe and serene, and I knew when I saw Fanrien that the walls he feared were not those of his house, but those of his psyche. If he believed sleeping outside would be his salvation, then it would be, because belief is all it takes. And delusions can be as effective as they are comforting. Fanrien isn't the only one with a crippling obsession. The Argonian named Big Head, whose head isn't particularly noteworthy in regards to its size, is compulsive about cutlery, particularly forks. His tale is rather tragic, as we can trace it back to a time before he was whisked away to the madhouse. In 3rd Era 427, Big Head lived in isolation on an island northeast of Aldredania in Vardenfell, where he collected silverware. He had in his possession the Fork of Hirripilation, an artifact of the Mad God. When asked about it, he said, "The Fork of Hirripilation, it sings to me, oh yes, sings like the rocks sing. Songs of weeping, songs of leaping. Do you weep, stranger? You've come to take it. Will it take you? Then will you weep? Weep like the rocks. It is here, take it. Take it if you will, take it if you won't. Singing, ringing." And after the Nerevarine took the fork, he said, "You have the fork is yours. The Master loves his forks for all of us." It is pretty clear that Big Head had been visited by Uncle Sheo, and it was no ordinary knife, fork or spoon that began singing to the Argonian and gave him goosebumps. It was specifically the Fork of Hirripilation. This fork is not for dining, but for tuning, and its acoustic resonations infiltrated the mind of Big Head, and its two sharp prongs metaphysically prodded him down the slippery slope to the Shivering Isles. The Padamaic reverberations of this tuning fork disrupt the magicka that seeps into the mundus from Aetherius. Magicka exists within all mundane things, and mortals are no exception. Thus, the fork can deprive its wielder of magicka. Nevertheless, it seems the fork's Hirripilation effect can be alluring to mortals like Big Head. Despite willingly giving the fork to the Nerevarine, he soon went even madder without it. No doubt the Prince of Mischief had no small role to play in this sapping of sanity. Big Head called Sheogorath his master, and said that he brings no cake, only visions, and loud words that Big Head cannot hear. Sometime in the following 6 years, Big Head found himself in Bliss, in search of the Fork of Hirripilation once again. Music and sound are powerful spiritual forces in the Aurbis, and exposure to Sheogorath's tuning fork may just reveal secrets that cannot be conveyed through language. Whatever the case, just like Crucible, there's no shortage of lunacy in Bliss. While I awaited Haskell's summons to Sheogorath's palace, I stopped for a pint at the Choosy Beggar, and I was grateful to find my headache begin to subside as the haze of intoxication dulled my senses. I spent some time pondering the nature of Bliss and Crucible, and as I did, one of the many bards taking up residence in the Isles took a seat by the fire and brandished a lute of varnished beech and mahogany. I could smell the dwarven oil that gave the wood its shine from across the tavern. The bard rested it on his lap with paternal delicacy. He gave each of the gut strings a pluck, before carefully winding the pegs, pulling them taut until they sang just right. If only Bighead were here tonight with his tuning fork of horripilation, perhaps the tones would be divine, and all in attendance would achieve Kim. When the bard was ready, he strummed a chord, and in a way that only music can, it lulled every soul in the Choosy Beggar to an attentive silence. And for a quantity of time I soon lost track of, I and every other patron succumbed to the trance of 8 strings singing in synchronicity. It came as no surprise to me that the Choosy Beggar would attract the greatest mortal musicians within and without the Mundus. Sheogorath made an effort to douse the finest creative minds and ensnare them in the Isles with the promise of inspiration. After all, there is a myth of the mad god inventing music that goes as follows. In the earliest of days, in a time when the world was still raw, Sheogorath decided to walk amongst the mortals. He donned his guise of gentleman with a cane and moved from place to place without being recognized. After 11 days and 11 nights, Sheogorath decided that life among mortals was even more boring than his otherworldly existence. What can I do to make their lives more interesting? He said to himself. At that same moment, a young woman nearby commented wistfully to herself, "The sounds of the birds are so beautiful." Sheogorath silently agreed with her. Mortals could not make the beautiful and inspired calls of birds. Their voices were wretched and mundane. He could not change the nature of mortals, for that was the purview of other Daedric princes. However, he could give them tools to make beautiful sounds. Sheogorath took hold of the petulant woman and ripped her asunder. From her tendons he made lutes. From her skull and arm bones he made a drum. From her bones he made flutes. He presented these gifts to the mortals, and thus music was born. It is known that the Daedra lords can't seem to resist the temptation to meddle with the affairs of mortals. They're constantly prodding the anthill, tricking the people of Tamriel, goading them, torturing them, or trying to create new worshippers. But when it comes to Sheogorath, it's especially clear why he would have an interest in the goings-on of the Mundus. According to varieties of faith in the Empire, Sheogorath the Mad God, the fearful obeisance of Sheogorath is widespread, and is found in most Tamrielic quarters. Contemporary sources indicate that his roots are in Old Merry creation stories. Therein, he is born when Lorkhan's divine spark is removed. One crucial myth calls him the Sithis-shaped hole of the world. If Sheogorath is born when Lorkhan's heart is ripped from his chest, then the Mad God is a part of Lorkhan's creation, and the convention atop the Adamantine Tower was his personal crucible. Mortals possess free will. They are founts of variability, of invention, of genius. The text titled Aedra and Daedra states that Aedra is usually translated as ancestor, which is as close as Cyrodiilic can come to this elven concept. Daedra means roughly not our ancestors. Aedra are associated with stasis. Daedra represent change. Aedra created the mortal world and are bound to the earthbones. Daedra, who cannot create, have the power to change. We see this limitation of the Daedra everywhere, a prime example being the Daedric Titan. Because Molag Bal cannot create, he imprisoned a dragon named Bozikodstron in his vile laboratory and corrupted him, replacing his Anuic animus, his soul, with a Daedric vestige. Sheogorath similarly feeds on the creations of the Mundus and takes inspiration from them. But if the gods' origins, as proposed in Varieties of Faith, are true, can he not create, at least in some small way? That's a question I cannot answer, only posed to you. But any being, eternal or finite, that is born from the death of the missing god, would certainly have a connection to the children of Nirn. When walking Nirn as the gentleman with a cane, did Sheogorath truly invent music? Or is he, in actuality, the spirit that resembles the mortal invention of music? That distinction fascinates me, and we'll return to it soon. Sheogorath encourages creativity, that raw, beautiful power that reminds him of his own birth. But he also nurtures stagnation, as seen in Crucible. Just as the myths of Sheogorath demonstrate his inspiration, they also portray his brutal treatment of those who do not please him. He punishes those who are too orderly. The story of Sheogorath and King Liandir tells of the latter king exercising his exceedingly rational ideals on his subjects. He lived in a palace that was a small, simple structure, unadorned with art and ugly to look upon. I do not need more than this, he would say. Why spend my gold on such luxuries when I can spend it on my armies or on great public works? Of course, King Liandir was focused on ruling his kingdom. He wasn't thinking about Sheogorath. But the mad god would take issue with Liandir's philosophy. What's the point of living if not for adornment? If not for art and expression? Why not just be an amoeba? Sheogorath would say free will and sapience are wasted on such mortals. His kingdom prospered under his sensible rule. However, the people did not always share the king's sense of practicality. They would build houses that were beautiful to look upon, although not necessarily very practical. They devoted time and energy to works of art. They would celebrate events with lavish festivals. In general, they were quite happy. King Liandir didn't understand. Why would his subjects spend their coin and commit valuable resources so extravagantly for such frivolities? And since King Liandir was wealthier than the common folk, since he was more prestigious, he came to the reasonable conclusion that he knew better than them. So he did as all good kings do. He restricted their expression, ensuring that all buildings served a purpose. Every plank of wood and every slab of stone should be accounted for, so that every building would profit the king, or modestly house the serfs who would profit him. The people, tolerant of their tyrant, abided. They stopped expressing themselves through architecture, and instead spent their excess wealth on works of art to hang in their homes. Once again, the unabashedly astute and frugal King Liandir protested. So he banned all works of art in the city. Were it not for the Lord of the Never there, this story would almost certainly have continued on the same trajectory until the people rebelled and ultimately lopped off King Liandir's superior head. For as you probably predicted, the people soon turned to another form of expression, in this case revelry, and again King Liandir banned it. Insurrection stirred, kept to a simmer only due to King Liandir's army of zealous sycophants. With nowhere to turn, the populace turned to prayer, and you'll never guess who answered these prayers. Sheogorath heard their pleas and decided to visit King Liandir. He appeared to the king in his dreams as a field of flowers, each with arms instead of petals, and the face of the mad god in the centre. I am Lord of the creative and Lord of the deranged. Since you have no use for my gifts of creativity, I have decided to bless you with an abundance of my other gift. While I may argue later in this very video that the gifts of madness and creativity are siblings, Sheogorath showed King Liandir madness without creativity. And madness without creativity is order. Cold-blooded, emotionless order. From that day forward, every child born in the city was born into madness. Since infants do not reveal illnesses of the mind, it was several years before this was realised. The king's own son was among the victims, suffering from seizures and delusions. Yet King Liandir refused to change his ways. When his son, Glint, was 12 years old, he stabbed his father while Liandir was sleeping. With his dying breath, King Liandir asked, "Why?" His son replied, "It is the most practical thing I could do." And though the glint had faded from Liandir's eyes, he could not be bitter, for it was his pragmatism that had manifested in his son. King Glint was a paranoid youth and a hypochondriac. He was also jealous of his authority and acted upon it. The new young king ordered all the palace servants slaughtered. He ordered a grand festival to celebrate his new reign and the repeal of Liandir's laws. He served the crowds a stew made from the carcasses of the palace servants. He ordered the east-facing walls of every building painted red, and the west-facing walls painted in stripes. He decreed that all citizens wear ornate masks on the backs of their heads. He then burned down the palace and began construction of a new one. In the new palace, the young king ordered his personal chambers to not have any doors, for fear that small woodland creatures would attack him. He ordered that it have no windows, for fear that the sun and moon were jealous of him and plotting his death. And thus ended the line of King Liandir. The people of the city returned to their grand works of art and raucous celebrations. They talked and acted as if they still had a living king, and even kept up the palace, using it to house and care for their mad children. Sheogorath was mightily pleased with this outcome. From that day forward, the city was blessed with more than the normal number of gifted artists and deranged citizens. Glint's orderliness had exiled him from society, from reality, just as Jiggalag had been cursed to wade the waters of Oblivion until the end of every era. The obsessive, compulsive desire to have every facet of his existence align with his regime had led to Glint's downfall. He isolated himself until he mightn't have well existed. To think that order is the antithesis of madness is mad indeed, as orderliness was King Liandir and King Glint's madness. Order of this magnitude is an oppressive kind of perfectionism. Trying to fine-tune a kingdom as if the people are mindless drones was only going to end one way. The story of Liandir and his kingdom is a metaphor for Jiggalag and the Shivering Isles. Imposing his crystalline will upon the realm was doomed to end in destruction, each and every time. You can't have perfect order in a land defined by the mind of a mad god. The summons had come, not by pigeon, not by courier, but through a sensation inside my head. I emerged from Bliss and walked through the cloister into the courtyard of Sheogorath's palace. It was perfectly symmetrical, but for the fires burning in the braziers. Yellow flames for mania, blue for dementia. I took the steps 2 at a time, sporadically switching to 1 at a time in a pointless attempt to offset the symmetry. When I came upon the palace doors, a golden saint escorted me to a waiting room. I naively thought that perhaps Sheogorath would be willing to see me as soon as I arrived. But I then realised that waiting rooms would be exactly the kind of bureaucratic torture device that the mad god would find amusing. The waiting room is a liminal space. Even when full, every sorry soul in a waiting room is solitary. Time in a waiting room is so diluted that every second is an eternity. Thankfully, the Sovereign had the decency to provide entertainment. Some dated copies of the Black Horse Courier formed an apocryphal stack in the corner, like a portal to Mora's domain. I instead perused the Daedric artifacts kept behind glass lining the walls. Upon the first pedestal rested the Folium Discognitum. Of all the Daedric artifacts that come in the form of books, this was perhaps the one on the fewest number of people's must-read list. It's rumoured that this tome is filled with obscure knowledge, but in truth, its pages are filled with the scrawlings of madmen. To be fair, the best books I've read could be described the same way. The late Gene Wolfe and Brian Catling probably read it too. The characters and sketches on the Folium Discognitum are skittish. They huddle in the corners, in incomprehensible jumbles. and dart across the pages to avoid the reader's gaze. The second plinth held nothing. The ball of mage light fluttering in the empty space above it shone its light in vain. I suspected this was the place intended for the fork of Horripilation, which Bighead was probably holding up to his ear at this very moment. Ironically, the Argonian hadn't a hair on his body, so Forky's horripilating effects would have been as futile as this purposeless mage light. Next along was an ornate ebony right glove that almost looked as though it should be worn by a composer. Perhaps one by the name of Johann Gamblepuddy, de von Ausfern Splendenschlitter, Kraskrenbon Free Digger Dingle Dangle Dongle Dungle, Burstein von Nacker, Frascher Appelbanger, Horowitz, Tickelensik, Grandenotti, Speltinkle, Grandlich, Grumblemeyer, Speltewasser, Kurselich, Himberleisen, Bahnwagen, Gutenabend Bitter, Ein Nürnberger, Bratwursel, Gersberten, Mitzweimark, Lube Hunsfurt, Gumberaber, Schonendanker, Kalbsfleisch, Mittler Auker, von Hautkopf of Or maybe Sheogorath just designed the glove to seem like it was worn by a composer named Johann Gamblepuddy de von Ausfern. Gamblepuddy, or the ambiguous glove, is the ultimate accessory for the important and the affluent. It is said to have a detrimental effect on traits associated with the working class, like endurance, speed, strength and willpower. Serfs toiling in the fields all day would need these attributes in abundance. In exchange, the glove boosts agility, intelligence, personality and luck. So if you're luckier, cleverer, and more interesting than everyone else, this glove will make you even more better than everyone else. Gamblepuddy is also used in a pact between the Dunmer people and Sheogorath. Tradition held that Vivek made an offering of the glove to the fourth corner of the House of Troubles, and in turn, the Mad God made a concerted effort to meddle with the Dark Elves less frequently than he did with other races. The next artifact was not lit by mage light. Instead, there was a gaslight suspended above the platform. This artifact was the Memory Wand. Sometimes Sheogorath finds his menagerie of madness lacking, so he came up with a tool that could alter, delete, or cause a subject to relive their most horrific memories. By infiltrating the mind of the subject, the Memory Wand makes them doubt their own memories and experiences, opening the door to all manner of horrors, implanted directly into the psyche. This is an artifact Sheogorath would surely only implement in a most sour, sadistic mood. Beside the Memory Wand, defying the tendency of upright objects to fall over, stood the Staff of the Everscamp. Sometimes it's hard to take a wizard seriously if they're unstaved. Casting with your hands is impressive, but what do you hold while hiking through the mountains in search of arcane secrets? What do you rest on while listening to tedious youths? Casting without a staff is almost as sad as pondering without a beard to stroke. Alas, this particular staff may look intriguing, but its power leaves a lot to be desired. The Staff of the Everscamp does what the name says, casting 4 scamps that haunt the caster like unreachable liches. The wielder of this staff will be followed by these scamps forever. If they are slain and sent back to Oblivion, they will rematerialize beside the wielder, having forgiven or forgotten whatever caused their death. The staff slows the wielder, ensuring that they cannot outrun the Everscamps. And don't even think about disposing of the staff entirely, as it compels the wielder to keep hold of it. The only way to rid oneself of the staff is to find another fool willing to take it from you. Along the staff, in Daedric symbols, the word nonsense has been engraved. To Sheogorath, this staff may be just another source of shenanigans, but to someone stuck with it, privacy, peace and personal space would become distant memories. Sheogorath loves a good staff. The possibilities are endless, and there's nothing quite so enjoyable as twirling one's cane on a leisurely stroll, or wrapping a pesky bootlicker on the palms. Just so, the next artifact in Sheogorath's display was another staff, perhaps his best known, most unpredictable artifact. Behold the threefold maws of the Wabbajack, gaping with rage and regret. Wabbajack, 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 not Jabberwock, Wabbajack. With this staff, one could be the greatest mage to ever live, or the worst. Like betting all the gold you've ever earned on one cast of the die, it can be your crowning glory, or more likely, a fast track to lying face down in the stinking sewers of Crucible. There is a story of one man's revelations upon receiving the Wabbajack. To him it was a book of knowledge. The book, Wabbajack says, "Maybe I'm smarter because I know cats can be bats, can be rats, can be hats, can be gnats, can be thats, can be thises. And that doors can be bores, can be snores, can be flaws, can be roars, can be spores, can be yours, can be mine. I must be smart, for the interconnective system is very clear to me. Then why, or wherefore, do people keep calling me mad? Wabbajack, Wabbajack, Wabbajack." And the madman who wrote those words might just have been an emperor of the Septim dynasty. The same book states, "When you're the new king of solitude, every bit of knowledge helps." And Emperor Pelagius III just so happened to have been king of solitude, and then High King of Skyrim shortly before his ascension to the Ruby Throne. If you came into custody of the Wabbajack, would you use it? A nebulous sphere of sorcery gurgles inside the slobbering mouths of Jack's three faces, ready to spit on your foe. It can manifest in so many ways. It might become a fireball that engulfs your enemy, a thunderbolt, a spike of ice. It could disintegrate, transmogrify, paralyze, petrify. It could turn them into a mound of septims, or a chicken, a mud crab, a wheel of cheese. As with all things associated with the Mad God, the only limit is your imagination, or his caprice. The final display was coated in dust. Its glass hadn't been cleaned in some time. This artifact was not a popular one. Its tale was too tragic for most mortals' tastes. Its name is Nebcrescent, and it would appear to be the ultimate weapon for an illustrious warrior. Mage light reflected from the polished face of the blade. Its edge was freshly honed as if it had never seen battle. But I knew the stories, and I knew that Nebcrescent had taken lives. The handle was intricately carved, its crossguard bejeweled, and its pommel weighted perfectly to offset the wide arc of killing steel. Even through the glass I felt its call, coaxing me to wield it, to spill blood on the streets of New Sheoth. But I had read the 16 Accords of Madness, and knew Nebcrescent's seductive power. This blade appeared in Volume 12, when the Mad God summoned Malacath to pass judgment on a treacherous crime. As Sheogorath's 16 Accords suggest, the trickster has had dealings with all the demon lords of misrule. For reasons we'll discuss in great detail soon, Sheogorath takes great pleasure in tricking his princely peers. Malacath, the subject of the 12th Accord, is the patron of the scorned and the shunned, and the Mad God took this sphere into consideration when planning his rendezvous with this fellow corner of the House of Troubles. This tale hails from a time before the founding of Orsinium, a time when the Orsimer people were at their most divided and nomadic. Orcs in this time needed to carve out homes in regions where they were detested. Many of these courageous pariah folk became immortalized in song and story. Emeg Grokeira would certainly have become one of these legendary figures, for he was a remarkable smith and warrior. But his path took a dark turn one night in the forests of Tamriel's northwest. Here is a shortened version of Emeg's story, as written in the 12th Accord of Madness. Less than 2 years after ascending to maturity, Grokeira was making camp when a thin voice called out from the thickening night. He was surprised to hear the language of his people spoken by a tongue that obviously did not belong to an orc. "Lord Keira," said the voice, "tales of your deeds have crossed the lips of many, and have reached my ears." Peering into the murk, Emeg made out the silhouette of a cloaked figure, made wavy and ephemeral by the hazy campfire. From the voice alone, he had thought the interloper an old hag, but he now decided that he was in the presence of a man of slight and lanky build, though he could discern no further detail. Perhaps the wary orc began, "But I seek no glory. Who are you?" Ignoring the question, the stranger continued, "Despite that, Orsimer, glory finds you, and I bear a gift worthy of it." The visitor's cloak parted slightly, revealing nothing but faintly glinting buttons in the pale moonlight, and a bundle was withdrawn and tossed to the side of the fire between the two. Emeg cautiously removed the rags in which the object was swathed. "Her name is Neb Crescen," spoke the thin stranger, seeing the appreciation lighting Rokaera's face. "It's only proper that I pass her on to one such as yourself. To possess her is to change your life forever." Emeg had kept Neb Crescen in its scabbard for a week before his solitude was disturbed by a susurration through the tree line. This wasn't game. The noise he heard was made by a man, or an elf, or since he wandered the woods of Hyrok, likely something in between. Emeg's nostrils flared, but he was upwind, being unable to see or smell his guest, and knowing that the breeze carried his scent in that direction. Emeg's guard was up, and he cautiously drew Neb Crescen from its sheath. Emeg himself was not entirely sure of all that happened next. The first moment of conscious memory in Emeg Rokaera's mind after drawing Neb Crescen was the image of the curved blade sweeping through the air in front of him, spattering blood over the virginal powder coating the forest floor. The second memory was a feeling of frenzied bloodlust creeping over him, but it was then that he saw for the first time his victim, an orc woman perhaps a few years younger than himself, her body a canvas of grisly wounds, enough to kill a strong man 10 times over. Emeg's disgust overwhelmed the madness that had overtaken him, and with all his will enlisted, he released Neb Crescen from his grip and let the blade sail. With a discordant ringing, it spun through the air and was buried in a snowdrift. Emeg fled the scene in shame and horror, drawing the hood of his cloak up to hide himself from the judging eyes of the rising sun. The scene where Emeg Rokaera had murdered one of his own kind was a macabre one. Below the neck, the body was flayed and mutilated, almost beyond recognition, but the untouched face was frozen in a permanent expression of abject terror. A deep silence fell over the bloodied glade, a morbid kind of tranquility. Around her corpse, the frosty grasses, flecked with crimson, continued to sway, oblivious. The soil drank her vitality voraciously. To the forest, it was just another blessing of rain from Kine, only this shower tasted of iron. The woman's heart drummed its coda, each beat weaker than the last, until finally, under the vigil of the ascending sun, it ceased entirely. Golden threads streamed through the tree line, carried on sunlight wings, a million bright ambassadors for the cloaked figure, who as if on cue emerged from the understory. It was here that Sheogorath performed certain rites that summoned Malacath, and the 2 Daedric lords held court in the presence of the disfigured corpse. "Why show me this, mad one?" began Malacath, once he recovered from his initial wordless outrage. "Do you take such pleasure in watching me grieve the murder of my children?" But Sheogorath reassured Malacath that this display was not to satisfy his sadism, but instead an act of divine vengeance. From one corner to another, Sheogorath was offering an opportunity for the defender of the betrayed to avenge the wrongful killing of an orc. And what's more, Sheogorath would take care of the post-mortem punishment. By using a blade of Sheogorath's choosing, Malacath could cut down the killer while sending his soul to be imprisoned in the Shivering Isles. Malacath took the discarded blade from the snowdrift and went to hunt. Malacath materialized in the path of the murderer, the cloaked figure obscured through a blizzard haze. Bellowing a curse so foul as to wilt the surrounding trees, the blade was drawn, and Malacath crossed the distance more quickly than a wild fox. Frothing with rage, he swung the blade in a smooth arc, which lopped the head of his foe cleanly off, then plunged the blade up to its hilt in his chest, choking off the spurts of blood into a steady, growing stain of red, bubbling from beneath the scaled armor and heavy cloak. Panting from the unexpected immediacy and fury of his own kill, Malacath rested on a knee as the body before him collapsed heavily backwards and the head landed roughly upon a broad flat stone. The next sound broke the silence like a bolt. I'm sorry, sputtered the voice of Emeg Rokaera. Malacath's eyes went wide as he looked upon the severed head, seeping blood from its wound, but somehow kept alive. Its eyes wavered about wildly, trying to focus on the aspect of Malacath before it. The once proud eyes of the champion were choked with tears of grief, pain, and confused recognition. To his horror, Malacath recognized only now that the man he had killed was not only one of his awesomer children, but very literally a son he had blessed an orc maiden with years hence. For achingly long moments the two looked upon each other, despondent and shocked. Then, silent as oiled steel, Sheogorath strode into the clearing. He hefted Amegrokaira's disembodied head and bundled it into a small, grey sack. Sheogorath reclaimed Neb Crescent from the corpse and turned to walk away. Malacath began to stand, but kneeled again, knowing he had irreversibly damned his own offspring to the realm of Sheogorath, and mourned his failure as the sound of his son's hoarse pleas faded into the frozen horizon. This beautiful blade before me had been forged and enchanted with intent, meticulously made to traumatize Malacath. The orcs are renowned for their ferocity in battle, but Neb Crescent nudges that ferocity into recklessness, showing the pariah folk how easily a warrior can be turned into a monster. And Malacath, who prides himself on being the guardian of the downtrodden, was deceived into decapitating his own flesh and blood. An honourable orc, victimised by the trickster. But Sheogorath's cruel tricks often come with an opportunity for the prince to think laterally, to reconsider the faults in their spheres. In the case of Malacath, Neb Crescent demonstrated the dangers of being too eager to enact vengeance, the importance of forbearance when passing judgment on one who has wronged you. This doesn't excuse the Mad One's manipulation, of course, but it's worth taking into consideration. Such harsh lessons are present in all of Sheogorath's accords. The 9th accord tells of Sheogorath's wager with the Dreamweaver Vaermina. This accord shows not only the Mad God's insistence that his fellow Daedra lords should open their minds, but also his consummate understanding of creativity, an understanding he evidently found lacking in the Mistress of Nightmares. This is the tale of a Breton writer named Darius Shano, who was blessed with a gift all creatives yearn for: inspiration. Each night, Vaermina would manifest in Shano's chamber, and with sinuous fingers, braid a nightmare so horrific that the anguished author would pant and cry, writhing in a stew of sweat and twisted sheets. The Dreamweaver made these terrors so vivid that they bled into his waking mind, turning his life into phantasmagoria, reality and nightmare coalescing before his eyes. Darius Shano knew he could only endure so much before his sanity was eroded by this oniric onslaught. He needed an outlet, a way to process his torment, perhaps even make a friend out of it, and he found salvation on empty parchment. Characters became his guardians, armed with punctuation. Sentences became his spells, and prose his fortress. From this vantage, Darius could watch the horrors hurl themselves against the walls. He could study them, admire them, channel their bridled power into magic. But everything changed one night when Vaermina came to Shano's chamber with an escort. Standing over Darius Shano while he lay quietly in his bed were his mistress, Vaermina the Dreamweaver, and the mad god Sheogorath. Vaermina looked down with pride at this disciple of hers, and was boastful of her little jewel. Such potential in this one. Through dreams of inspiration, I have nurtured literary talent into fruition, and now he stands in acclaim as an emerging bard and poet. He will gain much favour before I tire of him. Sheogorath too gazed at the young Breton artist, and saw that he was indeed famous among the other mortals. Mused Sheogorath, but how many are there who hate this mortal whom you have built? It is the hatred of the mortals which confirms greatness, and not their love. Surely you can accomplish this as well. It takes a lot of courage to put art out into the world. Art is personal, it's raw, but there is one thing above all others that every artist should fear when sharing their creations with wider society. It's not being criticised, it's not being hated, it's being forgettable. Art can evoke every emotion, but to evoke only indifference, that's a nightmare beyond even Vaermina's capabilities. Of course, most artists would like to inspire positive emotion, love, friendship, courage, desire, awe, but there is incredible power in evoking negative emotion too, dread, revulsion, shame. When was the last time you willingly stared at a painting, or read a passage in a book, that made you feel genuine disgust? If a creation can make you feel such strong negative emotion, whether you appreciate it in the moment or not, that creation is a magnificent work of art. Many well-loved, illustrious figures are immortalized in history and culture, but oftentimes the most egregious figures make the biggest impression and are remembered for their vile actions. Vaermina had shown she can inspire a mortal to fame. Now Sheogorath was challenging her to inspire a mortal to infamy. Perhaps, Dreamweaver, it would be amusing to show who has this power. Inspire foolish, arrogant hatred of this mortal for 10 years, and then I will do the same. We shall see whose talents are most efficient, free of aid or interference from any of the Daedra. At this, she relaxed into confident pleasure. The mad god is indeed powerful, but this task is suited to my skills. The mortals are repulsed by madness, but rarely think it worthy of hate. I shall take pleasure in revealing this to you, as I bring the more subtle horrors out of this mortal's subconscious. And so, in the 19th year of his life, the dreams Darius Shano had been experiencing began to change. Fear had always been part of the night for him, but now there was something else. A darkness began to creep into his slumber. A darkness that sucked away all feeling and colour, leaving only emptiness behind. When this happened, he opened his mouth to scream, but found that the darkness had taken his voice as well. All he had was the terror and the void, and each night they filled him with a new understanding of death. Yet, when he woke, there was no fear, for he had faith that his lady had a purpose. Indeed, one night Vaermina herself emerged from the void. She leaned in close to whisper into his ear, "Watch carefully, my beloved." With that she pulled the void away, and for hours each night she would reveal to Darius the most horrible perversions of nature. Men being skinned and eaten alive by other men, unimaginable beasts of many limbs and mouths, entire populations being burned, their screams filled his every evening. In time, these visions gnawed at his soul, and his work began to take on the character of his nightmares. The images revealed to him at night were reproduced on the page, and the terrible cruelty and hollow vice that his work contained both revolted and fascinated the public. They revelled in their disgust over every detail. There were those who openly enjoyed his shocking material, and his popularity among some only fed the hatred of those who found him abhorrent. This continued for several years, while the infamy of Darius grew steadily. Then, in his 29th year, without warning, the dreams and nightmares ceased. Now it was Sheogorath's turn to make Darius hate it, and this is where the mad god excels. Vaermina asserted that mortals are repulsed by madness, but rarely think it worthy of hate, and her logic led her to believe this challenge was better suited to her sphere. But she was mistaken, because as we've discussed at length, Sheogorath holds dominion over creativity as well as madness, and he was about to sever Darius of his connection to the transmundane, his transcendent genius. The tortured artist was suddenly given reprieve from his nightmares, but it was replaced by an eerie silence, a silence he felt compelled to fill with thoughts. Had he upset the Weaver of Dreams? Had she abandoned him? When he went to bed at night, the quiet lulled him to sleep. He slept long and well. His pallid complexion brightened. The dark circles under his eyes faded. His body began to function as nature intended, and as his rejuvenation worsened, he stopped being such a spectacle. Interest in the works of Darius Shano waned. His prose became stale, and his ideas failed to provoke the shock and outrage they once had. As the memory of his notoriety and of his terrible dreams faded, the questions that raced in his mind eventually produced resentment against Vaermina, his former mistress. Resentment grew into hatred. From hatred came ridicule, and over time ridicule became disbelief. Slowly it became obvious. Vaermina had never spoken to him at all. His dreams were simply the product of a sick mind that had righted itself. He had been deceived by his own subconscious, and the anger and shame overwhelmed him. The man who once conversed with a deity drifted steadily into heresy. In time, all of the bitterness, doubt and sacrilege focused in Darius a creative philosophy that was threaded throughout all of his subsequent work. He challenged the gods themselves, as well as the infantile public and corrupt state for worshipping them. He mocked them all with perverse caricatures, sparing no one and giving no quarter. He challenged the gods in public to strike him down if they existed, and ridiculed them when no such comeuppance was delivered. To all of this, the people reacted with outrage far greater than they had shown his previous work. His early career had offended only sensibilities, but now he was striking directly at the heart of the people. His body of work grew in size and intensity. Temples, nobles and commoners were all targets of his scorn. Finally, at age 39, Darius wrote a piece entitled "The Noblest Fool," ridiculing the emperor god Tiber Septim for integrating into the pathetic Nine Divines cult. The local king, Daenia, who had been humiliated by this upstart in the past, saw his chance. For his sacrilege against the empire, Darius Shano was executed, with a ceremonial blade in front of a cheering crowd of hundreds. His last bitter words were gurgled through a mouthful of his own blood. Darius Shano succumbed to a fate worse than death to an artist. He became a political commentator. By completely withdrawing from Shano's mind, Sheogorath sapped him of inspiration. His spark was choked, his cutting edge dulled, and without his own edge to cling onto, he clambered for purchase. Desperate and uninspired, he became a critic. 20 years after their wager was first placed, Vaermina and Sheogorath met over Darius Shano's headless corpse. The Dreamweaver had been eager for this meeting. She had been waiting for years to confront the Daedric Prince over his lack of action. "I have been deceived by you, Sheogorath. I performed my half of the bargain, but during your 10 years you never contacted the mortal once. He owes none of his greatness to you, or your talents, or your influence." "Nonsense," croaked the mad god. "I was with him all along. When your time ended and mine began, your whispers in his ears were replaced with silence. I severed his link to that from which he found the most comfort and meaning, and withheld the very attention the creature so desperately craved. Without his mistress, this man's character could ripen under resentment and hatred. Now his bitterness is total, and overcome by a madness fueled by his rage, he feeds me in my realm as an eternal servant." Sheogorath turned and spoke to the empty space by his side. Indeed, Darius Shano was a glorious mortal, despised by his own people, his kings, and even by the gods he mocked. For my success, I shall accept 80 followers of Vaermina into my service, and the dreamers will awaken as madmen. And thus did Sheogorath teach Vaermina that without madness, there are no dreams, and no creation. Vaermina will never forget this lesson. Without madness, there is no creation. Without Sheogorath, there is no divine spark. But no matter how many times Sheogorath shoved this lesson in the faces of the Daedra lords, they refused to learn. When it came to the Sikva chord, Sheogorath knew his target was hardly a match for his wits. The master of the hunt was many things, athletic, passionate, even loyal and loving, but he was not the wisest. Nevertheless, the mad god scheduled a meeting of the two princes, and plotted a way to teach Hircine a thing or two about paternity. Ever proud and boastful, Oblivion's mad prince stood 1/5 day of mid-year among the frigid peaks of Skyrim, and beckoned forth Hircine for parley. The huntsman god materialized, for this was his day, and the boldness of Sheogorath intrigued him. Wry without equal, Sheogorath holds in his realm giggling loons, flamboyant auteurs, and craven mutilators. The mad prince will ply profitless bargains, and promote senseless bloodshed for nothing more than the joy of another's confusion, tragedy, or rage. So it was that Sheogorath had set a stage on which to play himself as rival to Hircine. Without haste, the coy prince proffered his contest. Each prince was to groom a beast to meet at this place again, 3 years to the hour, and do fatal battle. Expressionless behind his fearsome countenance, Hircine agreed, and with naught but a dusting of snow in the drift, the princes were gone to their realms. While he may not be the smartest, Hircine is no fool. He knew this contest was suited to his strengths, but refused to allow this fact to make him complacent. He returned to his hunting grounds and appraised the manifold monstrosities of his realm, twisted perversions of creatures seen on Nirn. Not even the most ferocious of the bestial hordes would be sufficient to best the mad god. So he bred a new abomination in a hidden grove of his forested domain. An ancient Daedroth he summoned, and imbued it with the foul curse of lycanthropy. Of pitch heart and jagged fang, the unspeakable horror had no peer, even among the great hunters of Hircine's sphere. It's not explicitly stated when the curse of lycanthropy, or therianthropy if we're going to be pedantic about it, was created, but I believe this might have been it. With Sheogorath's inspiration, Hircine brought a never-before-seen horror into the Aurbis, a foul mixture of Daedroth and natural beast, not a creation, but a corruption. And so goes the rest of the accord. In the 3rd year, on the given day, Hircine returned, where Sheogorath leaned, cross-legged on a stone, whistling with idle patience. The prince of the hunt struck his spear to the ground, bringing forth his unnatural, snarling behemoth. Doffing his cap, sly as ever, Sheogorath stood and stepped aside to reveal a tiny, colourful bird perched atop the stone. Demurely it chirped in the bristling gusts, scarcely audible. In a twisted, springing heap, the Daedroth was upon the stone, leaving only rubble where the boulder had been. Thinking itself victorious, the monster's bloodied maw curled into a mock grin, when a subdued song drifted in the crisp air. The tiny bird lightly hopped along the snout of the furious Daedroth. Sheogorath looked on, quietly mirthful, as the diminutive creature picked at a bit of detritus caught in scales betwixt the fiery eyes of the larger beast. With howling fury, the were-thing blinded itself trying to pluck away the nuisance. And so it continued for hours, Hircine looking on in shame while his finest beast gradually destroyed itself in pursuit of the seemingly oblivious bird, all the while chirping a mournful tune to the lonesome range. Livid but beaten, Hircine burned the ragged corpse and withdrew to his realm, swearing in forgotten tongues. His curses still hang in those peaks, and no wayfarer tarries for fear of his wrathful aspect in those obscured heights. Turning on his heel, Sheogorath beckoned the minuscule songbird to perch atop his shoulder, and strolled down the mountain, making for the warm breezes and vibrant sunsets of the Abyssian coast, whistling in tune with the tiniest champion in Tamriel. Hircine's pride had robbed him of the ability to understand Sheogorath's lesson, for he had been mocked and emasculated, just as he'd been in the dawn when Nirni chose the forest god Ifri over him. In those elder days, Hircine had tended to his wounded ego through a display of ferocity, slaying the Gratelk and donning its head as a trophy. And in this sick accord, had he not burned the corpse of his failed champion and withdrew to the hunting grounds in a dusty trail of profanity, he might have taken Sheogorath's point. In creating this were monstrosity, Hircine had contributed to the tapestry of creation. In his own savage fashion, he had demonstrated ingenuity, but his competitive nature had blinded him, and he couldn't see the value of subtlety, of creatures that did not snarl and kill. While Sheogorath does attempt to help the Daedric princes to open their minds, he cannot account for the simple fact that, as Daedra and not Aedra, they cannot create, only corrupt. And for this reason, you'd think he envies the Aedra who did take part in creation. But it's hard to envy dead or at least distant gods who cannot impose their will upon their creations. Is it possible that the mad god is unique? Is it possible that he inhabits a sweet spot in the middle ground between excluded Daedra and absent Aedra? After all, the atrocities that inhabit his realm are quite different to anything seen in the Mundus. As a reminder, the text Aedra and Daedra states, Aedra created the mortal world and are bound to the earthbones. Daedra, who cannot create, have the power to change. While Varieties of Faith posits, Sheogorath is born when Lorkhan's divine spark is removed. One crucial myth calls him the Siphish-shaped hole of the world. The distinction between Aedra and Daedra is typically drawn when Lorkhan came to the other original spirits and posed to them the idea of creating the Mundus. Some spirits saw its potential, while others washed their hands of the whole affair. But matters of such magnitude are scarcely so simple. A certain historian is a synonym for a charlatan. The deeper we dig into the sediment of antiquity, the more ambiguous things become. When we scrutinise the known Daedra lords, we can see countless exceptions to the Aedra-Daedra, ancestor not ancestor rule. For example, Hermaeus Mora was, according to the imperial census of Daedra lords, born of thrown-away ideas used during the creation of mortality in the Mundus. And Meridia was once a Magna Gi, a child of Magnus, before she emancipated herself in a display of rebellious refraction, and carved out her own domain in the waters of Oblivion. Historians try their best to glorify their chosen gods, while admonishing against those they are trained to disdain. But these original spirits are anything but definable. We know from the monomyth that the gods fumbled around in the figurative dark, in search of their spheres of influence. Yet we are expected to believe that the categorizations of Aedra and Daedra are perfectly split. In truth, the powers and limitations of the gods, whether Aedric or Daedric, fluctuate from entity to entity, and in the case of Sheogorath, the god of madness and creation, born in the exact instant that Lorkhan's heart is torn free from his chest, I refuse to believe that this deity is incapable of original thought, of creation. He is as much tied to the structure of the Aurbis as he is to the chaos of Oblivion. And that's what makes him mad. That's what gives birth to Jigalag, his equal opposite. And that is why, beyond any Daedric disconnection or superiority complex, Sheogorath has a very real interest and connection with the Mundus, and with the mortals who occupy it. The mad god invites mortals to his realm because he is fascinated by the unpredictability of fickle mortals, the chaos of their undefinable consciousnesses, their creativity. As a mortal writing these words, the words you hear spoken now, I understand it. I feel Sheogorath's influence on my mind as I scratch these characters into the parchment before me. There is so much madness in writing, in speech. There is madness in the realization that the sentence you write, or the words you speak, are unique to the moment you write them, or the moment you say them. Were I to sit at any other time of day to write these words, in any other mood, with a different amount of sugar or caffeine or alcohol or magic in my system, the order of words would be different, their meanings transformed. You can only impose order on the words you write or say after they've been written or said. There's no order in that. He does his best, but that unpredictability innate to mortals is unattainable to Sheogorath, because he is constant and exists outside of time. That is the root of his fascination and his envy. He will never be as uniquely unorderly as a mortal can be. Thus, he has a fascination with the mad and the creative. He does have ties to the Aedra, being born when Lorkhan's divine spark was removed. He was born from the clash between Anuic Trinomac Auriel and Padamaic Lorkhan, and I believe I know why Sheogorath had to be born at this particular moment. Why is the dreaming sleeve, to which all animuses travel, such an obscure concept? What is it that separates an animus, a mortal soul, from the other spirits of the Aurbis? Perhaps mortals possess something truly original, that not even Lorkhan could have anticipated when plotting their invention. You've read the monomyth. You know that Auriel's champion, Trinomac, removed Lorkhan's divine spark. But what exactly is the divine spark? I've always interpreted this to mean his heart, or more specifically, his heart's beat, and I stand by that. If Lorkhan's heart does not beat, it is merely a stone, but every beat is a spark that ignites invention, imagination, life, love. Consider for a moment that the reason Lorkhan, aka Sheoth, aka Shazar, aka Akka, is the god of all human undertaking, is due to the fact that he bestowed his divine spark upon all mortals. This divine spark makes mortals more powerful than the Daedra who cannot create. This divine spark is imagination. Daedra do dwell in the Shivering Isles, and many of them serve Sheogorath. But this is the reason why the Mad God insists on populating his realm with mortals, mad ones, because they possess the divine spark. And since Sheogorath came into being at the exact moment the divine spark of imagination was ripped out in a spurting mess of scarlet, he is the spirit of the divine spark unleashed. Free from the confines of Lorkhan's limitful ribcage, imagination erupted from the severed arteries of divinity, spraying inspiration across the mundus, seeping into the soil that nourishes mortals. But this creativity was kept in by the Earthbones, preventing it from flowing through the estuary at the edges, into the waters of Oblivion. Thus, Sheogorath alone nurtures the divine spark beyond the realm of the dead god of imagination, and the Shivering Isles stand as remote bastions of madness and creativity in a sea of imaginative infertility. Back in the Mundus, Trinamac's violent trespass into Lorkhan's chest solidified the rules of the Mundus. Yes, the Earthbones slowly took their places as their powers waned, but without the divine spark, the gods lacked the imagination to go on inventing, and succumbed to limitation. Mortals, however, were not cursed in the same way, because they were Lorkhan's offspring, and their hearts beat in imitation of their maker. That was Lorkhan's gift. No wonder he said those infamous words at convention. This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other. It's ironic that some mortal races have turned away from Lorkhan, most notably the Anuic Altma, who generally perceive him as the adversarial spirit of man. Lorkhan isn't really the spirit of man, he is the spirit of mortals. Sadly, war had sapped the dominion of their spark, as in modern times they seem wholly driven by domination and destruction. There is no greater tragedy in all the worlds of creation than being unimaginative, to be blessed with consciousness and to let it go to waste. A door opened. In the threshold stood a scowling Grummite, only this Grummite was dressed in court finery, the ruff about his neck saturated in bog juice. With a quick gesture and a terse demeanour, he beckoned me into Sheogorath's throne room. I dared not question the Grummite, lest I lose the privilege of this meeting. I walked the bifurcated carpet, avoiding the soggy footsteps of the amphibious chamberlain. I approached the day, ready to genuflect before the prince. First impressions are crucial with such capricious spirits. But the throne was empty. Sheogorath stood in its shadow, in the embrace of the great tree behind it. The red and blue flames groping his shoulders made the features of his face flicker. The tenebrosity accentuated his features. His cheeks were sunken, his brow lurched over cat eyes, alert despite the heavy bags tugging at them from below. It seemed as though I'd caught Sheogorath in the throes of a deep depression. The Lord of the Neverthere had his keen eyes affixed to the font of madness, as if staring hard enough would reveal to him the secrets of the Aurbis. The Grummite belched politely, and Sheogorath turned his gaze upon me. In hindsight, I really can't explain it, how it felt to meet the Mad God's eye. It was like staring into a mirror, only the apparition on the other side was unbounded by the strictures of mortality. These eyes were wired to a mind that wasn't confined to a skull, that wasn't limited to a finite lifespan. What does a conscious being do when it can exist sempiternally? I know liches and vampires seek this kind of immortality often, but they are blinded by ego, by a will to exert power over lessers. This kind of eternal spirit was different. Eternity was innate to it, and by my estimation, eternity was unwelcome to it. Haskell's belch had left a gulch of silence, which the mad god finally filled.
Daedrologist, eh? Have you categorized us yet? Have you charted our waters, analyzed our spheres? You've deduced that I'm the monarch of madness, yes? What did you determine would be the outcome of this meeting?
If the Lord of the Never There was joking, there was no sign of it on his face. He offered no movement or expression to set a tone for the conversation, allowing me to colour the empty spaces in the exchange. I'm working on it, I replied. Categorization can be useful, but it will always be subjective, and can have near infinite combinations. I've deduced that you are the monarch of madness, and much, much more. In fact, I'd say your sphere makes you more like the mortals you preside over than you think. Ultimately, though, I just had a few questions. Sheogorath fiddled with his staff as he spoke, feigning disinterest, but the eyeball nestled in the staff's fork stared at me, unblinking.
Is that so?
The mad god caught his staff and took a seat on his throne.
You come to my realm. You make the claim that I conjured Jiglag up, like some fragment of my imagination, a fun little alter ego, and then you waltz into my throne room and presume to pick my brain. A click of my fingers, and you'd be dragged by your ankles to the squirming pits. Gyob would suck the smarts from your concept organ and floss with your bones. He likes the clever meals more.
I meant no disrespect, Lord Sheogorath, I said, but I figured a prince of your power would be indifferent to my slander, just as you brush off the sacrilegious ways of the heretics and the zealots, who have questioned your rule for centuries by mortal reckoning.
The heretics and the zealots can't agree on anything, yet they're equally deluded. They believe what they're told to believe, and the people telling them what to believe are the most delusional of all. They'll preoccupy themselves with semantics until their minds are mush. To me, it's all bleating. You, however, appear to think for yourself, and for that you need to be scrutinized. What did you come here to ask?
The Hill of Suicides, madness or, why trap their souls? You invite the mad to your asylum, and you trap them here. When they try to leave, you torment them eternally. Why? A rather naive question for any Daedrologist worth their salt. Every prince claims the souls of their worshippers. They sacrifice their shot at Aetherius when they dip their toes in the waters of Oblivion. Why should I treat them any differently? Because you're different. I sensed the mad god was being deliberately obtuse. You claim to represent creativity. You invite the most unique, divergent minds to your realm, and you hold them hostage. You should know better. I had finally overstepped, and the sovereign of the Isles cracked his staff against the stone floor. Next I knew, the air of the palace, which had been thick with tension, was replaced by fresh mountain air. But before I had a chance to draw it into my lungs, I was plummeting downwards. I don't know how long I fell. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours, days or lifetimes. In the madhouse, time passed as Sheogorath willed it. If you've ever jumped from height, you'll know that a great deal of thinking can be done in those moments when the adrenaline engulfs every fibre of your mortal being. Night had fallen over Sheogorath's domain, and from this elevation it felt as though I was among the stars. These stars here were not rifts to Aetherius, only imitations. No magicka pierced through them to embolden me as I fell. The velocity of my fall took me down an intangible tunnel, a corridor, a great psychic corridor. I ran down it so fast I can't say whether my feet ever touched the floor. And so I passed through this great corridor, a corridor unto Sheogorath's perfection, through a great sea of blackness, flecked with glowing Anuic orbs that watched. They were souls, and I had roused them. They were packed into the interstices, the numberless recesses along the corridor, like rooms at an inn that stretched to infinity. At the end of the corridor, if it could be called an end, shone a beacon that dimmed these orbs, a divine and limitless spark. I knew then that these were the souls of the asylum, the souls of men and mer who had gazed upon the mad god's spark and had died in the presence of the mad god's true face. I thought I heard the flickering congregation singing songs of jubilee in the presence of their king. This is all a dream, they crooned, a dream in death. I came to and realized those were not my thoughts, not my words, but the scrambled transmissions from all the lives that had perished from the same fall, only to have their souls linger, trapped on the vertebrae of the jester's spine, while their corporeal forms turned to madness awe. I was thankful to be reunited with my wits, but the reality of my situation was ever the more urgent. The blood-stained stones of Punishment Point came into view, and I rushed to meet them head first. Had I opened my mouth a moment later, I would have certainly died. But in this falling dream in death, I was the master of time, and I uttered an incantation in the nick of time. Alteration School, Levitation Spell. With a ferocious jerk and a lash of the spinal whip, I came to a halt, levitating a hand span from the ground. I lived. Once again the air changed, back to the comforting air of agitation within Sheogorath's palace. Only this time, the silence was filled with laughter. The sovereign's depression had been replaced by euphoria. Through a mirthful grin, Sheo said,
"Oh ho ho! Quite the treacherous trick, Master Daedrologist. I thought that spell was outlawed in your mundane homeland. You cheated death. You cheated me."
I was still regaining my composure, but the fear for my life had subsided enough to restore my voice. I was led to believe that this land is subject to your subjective subjudication, my lord, and your smirk tells me you didn't entirely disapprove of my Telvanni trick.
Too much time around those mushroom dwellers studying alien sorceries, I say.
Sheogorath contorted his face in mock disgust.
They made fools of the Elysians with it, which I found amusing. But I never liked those bird-brained elves. They acquired a taste for all things Daedric, but barely worshipped me. Said I wasn't sadistic enough for 'em, they did. Can you believe that?
His expressions shifted to pensive with the fluidity of a theatre mask.
Perhaps I'm not. I changed my mind about your execution after all.
Have you considered that you were powerless to prevent my survival? A question that in his previous mood would have caused offence, merely made the Mad Lord laugh again.
All right, Daedrologist, you've entertained me enough to earn my respect. I will humour your theories on my nature.
The Prince of Madness lounged on his throne and listened to my theories. I will spare you the exact details of this homily, for the Prince interjected often, sometimes in protest, other times just to offer me tea and cheese. But here is a summary of the words I said in that meeting. One of the first lessons every Daedrologist learns is that it is a frivolous endeavour to try to measure the power of a prince, or to say with certainty that we know their motives and morality. They are gods and are quite unlike mortals. The best we can do is speculate based on how their spheres manifest. Sheogorath's sphere encompasses madness and creativity. It is the most nebulous, chaotic sphere of all, and his origins, as we discussed earlier in the video, set him apart from his peers. I truly believe that Sheogorath lures mortals into his realm because he is drawn to their divergent minds. In many ways, he wishes to nurture their creative spark, and wishes to appreciate their insanity. But in doing so, he unknowingly strips them of their magic, and of Lorkhan's gift to all mortals. By hoarding mad, creative souls in his asylum, he deprives them of their mortality. It is the inevitability of death that fuels the divine spark. That's why Lorkhan must die in the dawn of every Kalpa. He must lose the Elnathay war against the infinite Anuic spirits. If he were to prevail, he wouldn't be able to pass on his divine spark. Just as Nirn must die in childbirth to create a home for the mortals, Lorkhan must also die for his children. As I discussed in my Jiggalag video, and will expand on soon, Sheogorath is well aware of his permanence. His immortality is in constant conflict with his divine spark. created when Lorkhan's is ripped from his chest by Trinomac. In the Shivering Isles, Sheogorath is surrounded by upstarts and dissidents. I believe that the Mad God could not fully strip me of my magic because he does not have total control of his realm and his mind. Hence why Arden's soul could gain traction, along with every other mad mutineer in his midst, along with every other fragment of his own mad psyche. Creativity is as much my and every other mortal's sphere as it is Sheogorath's, because we too possess Lorkhan's divine spark of genius. This is why the Mad God introduced the Dragonborn with the following greeting.
I am a part of you, little mortal. I'm a shadow in your subconscious, a blemish on your fragile little psyche. You know me, you just don't know it.
Mortals are mad, broken, brilliant little things, and their brilliance lies in their frailty, for even the brightest lights will one day burn out. Sheogorath was born in a moment of extreme turmoil, when chaos solidified in the Mundus, and the Aedra sprung the trap. He shares the madness innate to mortals, and loves their lunacy, but like a devouring mother, he smothers their spark, and forces them to outlast their finite lives, imprisoned in his mind, sharing his eternal sentence. When my audience with Sheogorath came to an end, he appeared to be perfectly balanced between his two states, between woe and glee. He measured my words, and passed his judgment. He agreed to free the souls trapped on the Hill of Suicides, stating that he had done the same once before in the past, inspired by the heroism of another of the voices currently occupying his head. He then opened a portal between us. Through the membrane of swirling sorcery, Sheogorath's visage warped, and in the moment I vanished from his realm, the rippling effect made his face display every conceivable emotion simultaneously. Suddenly, I was back in my tower, welcomed by the familiar musty air of my study. For the first time in my dealings with the Daedra lords, I felt sympathy wash over me. I spoke a small prayer to the Mad God for his mental health. The Mad God's library was filled with mortal texts. Besides the Elder Scrolls, Mora's Black Books, and Dagon's Mysterium, all the best texts were written by mortals. On this particular day, over the morning's wine and cheese, he picked up an old one with a creased spine and bent corners, all the signs of a loved book. It was titled Aedra and Daedra, and within its stained pages Sheogorath found these words. As part of the divine contract of creation, the Aedra can be killed. Witness Lorkhan and the Moons. The Protean Daedra, for whom the rules do not apply, can only be banished. He closed the book, wrapped his fingers on the cover, and placed it by his unfinished breakfast. His appetite had wandered, so he set off on a stroll. He found he could only find the inspiration for his accords when walking. And it was about time he wrote number 17, the subject, Sheogorath. The Prince of Madness made his way to the doors of his palace, stopping in the vestibule to fetch his cane. He wondered about the weather. Rain was forecast. He chuckled, shook his head. These were the Shivering Isles. Only he could determine the weather. He would keep the skies clear, and he would ramble without the burden of a coat. He strayed beyond the palace grounds this time. The Jester's Spine Mountains overhead were too tantalizing not to ascend. It was a challenging hike, but there was an assurance to the act of walking. It was so predictable, so reliable. Left foot, right foot, this simple repetition, slowly wearing out his legs, gave him a sensation that made him feel mortal. He had probably conjured it inside his mind, passing it on to his body, for no god would really become fatigued from the act of walking. Nevertheless, it felt real to him, and he felt a connection to mortals whenever he did it. Every prince had their own realm, but how many of them took the time to explore it? To walk its trails, to observe its beauty? They were so preoccupied by their schemes. Sad. On his walks, Sheogorath was isolated from his duties of governance. Haskill couldn't find him here. To think and to walk, something about these concepts were inextricable to Sheogorath, though he couldn't say why. He'd felt, though he couldn't be sure, that in the realm of the godheads, the word learn had a fascinating etymology. In that realm, the word learn, which means to acquire knowledge, comes from the Old English word Liurnian, to get knowledge, to be cultivated. From Liurnian, the path leads further back, into the fricative thickets of Proto-Germanic, and to the word Lisnajan, which has a base sense of to follow or to find a track, from the Proto-Indo-European prefix lis, meaning track. To learn, therefore, means, at root, to follow a track. To wander is to gain knowledge. Perhaps this is why the gentleman with a cane was so fond of rambling. Stories are just like paths, and the greatest storytellers have walked those paths all their short lives. Sheogorath recalled that a forgotten prince had recently re-emerged, whose sphere was connected to this notion in some strange way. He would have to explore this more later. Sheogorath tried to cast his memory back to its wellspring, but like the soul before its coalescence within the embryo, he found only fog. A spirit with form, whether that be an original spirit or a mortal, forever strives for the singularity of the before time, when everything made perfect sense. But once the original spirits took their shapes, and mortals were born and lived their finite lives, that singularity was gone. That forgotten time is the fount of creativity, the creativity that Anu and Padamai could harness without restraint. Without access to that, one can only sub-create, rearrange the primary material in some particular way. For the inhabitants of Mundus, and of the Shivering Isles, this rearrangement could take the shape of a painting, a building, a song, a story, but each and every one, in their own unique way, gave the offspring of the divine some means of grazing their fingertips against the underside of the divine. And that ambition, Sheogorath surmised, was the genesis of his 16 Accords of Madness, 16 which would soon become 17. But no matter how much the Mad One convinced himself that he was truly inspired, no matter how much he convinced himself his legs were tired from walking, no matter how much he convinced himself he would someday die, these gifts of inspiration were bestowed by Lorkhan upon mortals, but not upon Sheogorath. Sheogorath could not die, thus he could not experience true inspiration. That was reserved for those whose days were numbered. As you sit here listening to these words, your days are numbered. As I sit here writing these words, so are mine. Feel it, the divine spark, live well and die. But the mad god cannot die, and for that he is resentful. Even when the voice in his head named Jiggalag comes to destroy his realm and his mind, it will always be rebuilt. There is no real consequence. Nothing is at stake. If your life cannot be stripped from you at any moment, if all your work can't be burned away and your thoughts cast into the ether, what is there to inspire you? You, dear listener, like me, the Daedrologist, will always live in fear. That fear may be small most days, but it's there. Whatever you hope to achieve in your time attached to that flesh vessel of yours, it could vanish at any moment, unfulfilled. Don't let your time alive be wasted. That urgency is Lorkhan's gift to all mortals. Sheogorath sat on the precipice of Punishment Point and gazed out over his domain. Sheogorath would never die, and so he would envy mortals for all time, for all the Kalpic cycles. This god is plagued by an existential crisis, but this god is immortal, and when these two concepts are combined, there is only one outcome: madness. Sheogorath sat on the precipice, and the skies above began to pour. Rain buffeted the Prince of Madness, until he wished he'd brought his coat. And that is the tale of Sheogorath, the Daedric Prince of Madness. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you enjoy these long-form Elder Scrolls lore videos, please like and subscribe, as they take a long time to make. If you'd like to support the channel further, I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description below, but please only pledge if you can comfortably afford to. Thank you so much again for watching. My name is Drew the Daedrologist. You've been watching Drew Mora, and I'll see you in the next one.